You're listening to the Piano Parent Podcast with Shelley Davis, episode 346. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Piano Parent Podcast, a weekly show designed especially for parents who are trying to help their piano kids make the most of piano lessons. My name is Shelley Davis, and I hold firmly to this lovely quote by fellow music educator Cheryl Lavender. She says, "The fact that children can make beautiful music is less significant than the fact that music can make beautiful children." Music certainly can make your child into a beautiful person, and you, being the most important person in your child's life, have a front row seat. My goal with this podcast is to help you and your piano kid make stronger connections with each other as you survive the emotional ups and downs of piano study. Thank you for listening. I'm glad you're here. Good morning, piano parents. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's installment of the Piano Parent Podcast. For my students this year, we are going to be focusing, not entirely, but we're going to put the spotlight on one particular composer who has a very big anniversary coming up on May the 7th of 2024. I'm not usually ahead of things. I'm usually running barely on time, which my husband would say is I'm running late. If you're on time, you're late. If you're 10 minutes early, you're on time. Anyway, I'm actually thinking ahead for once, and this composer has, as I said, a big milestone coming up on May the 7th, 2024. It's the 200th anniversary of a premiere of one of his masterpieces. And this year, I'm calling attention to some of the other milestones and big moments in this composer's life as I begin piano lessons with my students for this coming school year. So I'm going to be sending them to this episode so that they can listen to this mystery and see if they can figure out who this composer is. In their piano planners, I have put in a timeline for this composer, and I hope as they listen to the episode, they will mark a few different high points on their timeline in their planner. And I find it interesting that this was the very first musical mystery that I put together, and it was released 200 episodes ago. Back in June of 2019, episode 146 was the very first musical mystery. And here I am reintroducing it to prepare for the 200th anniversary of his big world premiere. So please enjoy this replay of Musical Mystery, Opus 1, Number 1, Wishful Thinking. If you're a regular listener to podcasts, chances are you have already heard the popular podcast called The Way I Heard It, written and produced by Mike Rowe. You may remember Mike Rowe as the host of the Discovery Channel's Dirty Jobs TV show. In his podcast, The Way I Heard It, Mike weaves a story, dropping hints about a seemingly obscure event, only to reveal at last that he is telling the backstory of a well-known person or event. His show is very similar to Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story, if you listened to radio back in the 70s or 80s. If you have not heard of Mike Rowe's podcast, I very much recommend it and would suggest that you listen to it, but please wait until after you hear my episode. Number one, I'm selfish and I hope to keep you here. And number two, his polished story will sound so much better after you hear my attempt. I'm calling this installment A Musical Mystery, Opus 1, Number 1, Wishful Thinking. And here it goes. I was falling down a YouTube rabbit hole the other day when I found a flash mob video. I love these videos where unsuspecting shoppers are treated to a surprise Christmas concert at a shopping mall, or drivers waiting at a traffic light in Hollywood are the captive audience of crosswalk musicals with James Corden and his famous guest entertainers. Anyway, the video I saw the other day started in a bustling courtyard, maybe somewhere in Europe. It didn't look like a city square in the United States. People were milling about, walking or biking to restaurants, window shopping, visiting museums, just minding their own business. And then the camera zooms in on a lone musician standing, frozen like a statue, behind his upturned hat, which is an obvious invitation for a tip or a donation or a handout. A young girl takes the bait by dropping a few coins in his hat. Then the musician comes to life and begins playing a low bass line, practically unidentifiable until other musicians meander through the crowd and join him. And what follows becomes a lovely musical experience that stops those shoppers in the video in their tracks, gathers a crowd, and even had the ability to bring me to tears just sitting at my own desk watching the video years later. I would have been beside myself if I had experienced this live and in person. People from all walks of life being united through music? Could that really happen? Or is it just wishful thinking? Where did this powerful music even come from? Who could have written such a moving melody? To learn that, we have to go back a few years. It had been about 10 years since Louie's last big hit. I can only imagine his nervous tension as he waited for the concert to start on that spring day of May 7th. It was going to be the biggest event of its kind ever. More musicians, more singers, an overflowing crowd in a massive auditorium. I suppose you could say his reputation was at stake. But I don't think Louie really cared about his reputation at this point. For him, it was all about the music. Louie had been attracted to music as far back as he could remember. And you would think having a musical father would give him the best advantage. His dad did recognize his talent and taught him to play piano a bit. Unfortunately, Louie's dad wasn't as successful at writing music as he would have wanted to be. So his wishful thinking made him determined to mold Louie into the entertainer he could have been but wasn't. Actually, he wanted Louie to be just like another popular child prodigy with rock star status. You see, while Louie was all about the music, his dad was all about the money. If Louie would just perform like that other kid, if they could get in with the right influencers, go to the right places, meet the right people, they'd be living like kings and queens. They'd be raking in the money. But Louie didn't want to be an imitator. He wanted to make his own sound, do things his own way. Whenever Louie's dad heard him making up his own melodies and not practicing the popular music of the day, his abusive words and actions would force Louie back into the restrictive path he expected. Sadly, when Louie's mom died, so did any buffer he might have had between his own music and his father's expectations. Disappointed about not getting a music gig when he thought he was a shoo-in, Louie's dad turned to alcohol for solace. After his wife's death, he drank even more. So much so that more of his paycheck went to the local bartender than to his 3 young, motherless sons at home. Louie's priorities had to change. He had 2 younger brothers to take care of. To keep his dad from spending every money he earned on alcohol, Louie made arrangements with his father's boss to send half of the weekly pay home to him and his brothers so they could buy food and pay the bills. Louie was only 17 years old. Some people in the crowd on that May 7th concert said he flailed about on stage, strutting back and forth, jumping around, giving the performance of a lifetime. Louie gave everything he had that night. But sadly, when it was over, He didn't hear the expected cheers and applause. All he heard was silence. What went wrong? How could this have happened? Let's go back a few more years. During his childhood, Louis was limited by his father's greed and selfish ambition. After his mother's death, he was bound by duty to care for his two younger brothers. Finally, when he was 22, his father also died, and he and his brothers were free to live their own lives. Louis relocated so he could focus more on his music, even hiring his middle brother Carl as his agent for a time. His younger brother John ended up studying to be a pharmacist assistant. Without his father's hindrance and with his brothers taken care of for the most part, Louis was finally free to pursue his own wishful thinking. At the age of 24, he staged his first solo gig, and by 27 had booked a full concert tour, ironically at many of the same locations his father would have expected, tracking the same route that child prodigy had taken years before. In fact, that child prodigy, now a grown man, spoke highly of Louis, saying, "Watch out for this young man. He's going to make a noise in this world." I told you it had been 10 years since Louis' last big hit. 10 years ago, he had been on top of the world. Enjoying the success of his solo career, Louis decided to branch out into other genres. His success in any style of music he attempted had him not only meeting the right people, but becoming their beneficiary. All the right people were contributing their own money to help Louis keep putting out the hits. He was applauded in the finest circles, invited to the best parties, welcomed everywhere he went. But all that was 10 years before May 7th, a full decade. And what a troubling decade it had been. The problems Louis faced in that decade came from 3 different fronts, not unlike problems you and I would face today. He had money problems, family trouble, and worst of all, failing health. The money problems came when some of those major benefactors, Louis' primary source of income, died. Louis not only grieved the loss of his good friends, but he lost their financial support as well. The family trouble came courtesy of his middle brother Carl. Remember, he had worked as Louis' agent at one time. He was a terrible agent, dealing harshly with music publishers. One story goes that he promised Louis' newest release to one publishing company without realizing that Louis had already promised it to another. On top of that, Carl had no business working as an agent when he couldn't even get his own act together. He got tangled up with a woman of ill repute who had already borne one son to another man and was now pregnant with Carl's child. The couple married against Louis' better judgment, and Carl died 6 short years later. Before he died, Carl granted joint custody of his young son, also named Carl, to both Louis and the boy's mother. Louis, who never married or had children of his own, was now the legal guardian of a young boy, and having to deal with the boy's mother, whom he had never liked or trusted to begin with. There were many years of custody battles in court, but that's not the focus of this musical mystery. I will tell you, however, that young Carl grew up to marry and have a family of his own with 4 daughters and 1 son, a son he named after his Uncle Louis. Besides the child custody battles, Louis found himself in court again, this time demanding custody and ownership of some of his music, which his so-called friends had pawned off as their own. Money problems? Louis had them. Family trouble? Don't even get me started. But both of those pale in comparison to Louis' biggest problem, his failing health. Well, not failing health so much as failing hearing. What could possibly be worse to a successful musician and songwriter at the top of his game than to lose the ability to hear? You've probably already guessed, because my hints aren't as mysterious as Mike Rose, that I've been talking about none other than Ludwig van Beethoven. Amid all the trials he endured between 1814 and 1824, money problems, family trouble, devastating hearing loss, Ludwig would finish the decade with not only a huge hit, it would be the biggest hit of his musical career, and remains one of the most well-known pieces of music in history. After more than 10 years of being out of the public eye, performing, suffering the loss of friends and financial support, dealing with stressful family situations, and enduring debilitating deafness, what did Beethoven choose to proclaim in his magnum opus? Ode to bitterness? Ode to anger or hatred? Ode to depression or despair? No. He proclaimed his ode to joy. Here's the English translation of part of the poem that he used. "O friends, no more of these sounds. Let us sing more cheerful songs, more songs full of joy, joy, joy. Joy, bright spark of divinity, daughter of Elysium, fire-inspired we tread within thy sanctuary. Thy magic power reunites all that custom has divided. All men become brothers under the sway of thy gentle wings." I want to read that last part again. Thy magic power reunites all that custom has divided. All men become brothers under the sway of thy gentle wings. The poem, Ode to Joy, was written by German poet Friedrich Schiller in the summer of 1785. Beethoven found it in 1793, not long after his father's death, and had long considered setting the poem to music. So when the Philharmonic Society of London commissioned him to write a new symphony, Beethoven took the opportunity to put his wishful thinking into action. He would conclude his massive Ninth Symphony with not only a grand orchestra, but he would also add a choir. That had never been done before, certainly not to this scale, but Beethoven, Louis as I've been calling him, had always wanted to create music his own way, break the rules, try new sounds. The premiere on that spring day, May 7th, 1824, was met with thunderous applause. Beethoven, facing the orchestra, couldn't hear the audience's reaction behind him. One of the musicians on stage indicated to Beethoven that he should turn around and face the audience. When he did, the silent reaction he had first heard burst into a vision of people on their feet, clapping, cheering, even throwing their hats and scarves in the air, so Beethoven could see their admiration for his music and for him. Since that wonderful opening night, since Beethoven's first call for all men to become brothers, the Ninth Symphony has been performed by thousands of orchestras. The main theme to that final movement, Ode to Joy, has been played by every young piano student who sits on my piano bench. Over the last 200 years, Beethoven's Ode to Joy has been the backdrop for many momentous occasions. In 1985, it was adopted as the official anthem for the European Union. Since World War II, the Ninth has become a Japanese New Year tradition. It was brought to Japan by German prisoners of war who played it to pass the time. On Christmas Day, 1989, Leonard Bernstein conducted a performance of Ode to Joy, combining musicians from East and West Germany to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Ninth has also been present at various opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games, which is to me the epitome of all people joining together to celebrate the strength and the abilities of the human race. Music is one of the lovely things in this world that has the ability to unite us. Some call it the universal language. I hope the next time you hear Louis' Ode to Joy, whether it's in a lovely concert hall or the background music for a commercial or your child's video game, Whether you're singing it at church or when you hear your piano kid practicing it on the piano, that you will join Mr. Beethoven's wishful thinking that all men would indeed become brothers, that all people would treat each other like family. That sounds good to me. Before I close out today's episode, I want to give a shout out to Nana and her Teach for Growth project. Nana is a teacher from Vietnam, but she's currently teaching in Seoul, Korea. She conducts interviews over Facebook live stream for her teaching community back home in Vietnam. I was honored to visit with her recently, and you can catch our full interview, our full video, on the show notes for this episode. So I want to say congratulations on your excellent Teach for Growth program, Nana. Hello to you and your listeners. And thanks to you, piano parent, for listening. And I look forward to seeing you next week. While your piano kid is practicing this week, I'd love to hear from you. How are things going? Is there a problem I can help you and your piano kid with? Do you want to share a celebration story? You can email me at Shelley@pianoparentpodcast.com or connect through the Facebook page or Instagram at Piano Parent Podcast. Of course, you can always visit the website at www.pianoparentpodcast.com. And you can go directly to any episode by adding the / and the episode number. You'll never miss an episode of the Piano Parent Podcast if you subscribe through iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. While you're there, would you please leave me a star rating and a review? This is not only a huge encouragement to me, but it will also help other piano parents find the show. And I'd be excited to share your review right here on the podcast.